from NMA headquarters, and I want to welcome you to our live online webinar, Conflict Resolution and Conflict Management. We have two experts in the subject that are going to be facilitating our workshop, our webinar today. I happen to know both of them, and I'd like to share a little bit of their background because I think it's an important piece of understanding how well this webinar today is going to go. Many of you will recognize Don Hart's name because he's both still an active member of our NMA Board of Directors, but also because he was our 2002 NMA Chairman of the Board. Don has been an active NMA member for 37 years. And in fact, he was even a charter member of the Hanford chapter, now the Mid-Columbia Leadership Development Association in the Tri-Cities of Washington State. Don has been active on our national board since 1995. He has he's held actually a variety of senior leadership positions, and those span over 40 years in the nuclear industry. He's currently principal in D. Hart Consulting Group, and he provides services from organizational issues, leadership training, operational engineering, and test activities and safety issues. He's active in many community organizations, and he served on a lot of boards, including sports officiating and management issues. And I don't know if volunteering in those kinds of organizations don't give you some practice in the art of conflict management, then I really don't know what does. Don holds a BS in Industrial Management from the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and he's completed his master's studies in Engineering and Project Management at the University of Pittsburgh. His partner in crime today is Gordon Beecher. And I first met Gordon when he was an executive advisor to Don's chapter there in Hanford. Gordon later went on to serve on our national NMA Executive Advisory Committee and was really instrumental in helping us chart a strategic direction for the association in the early 2000s. He does bring a well-rounded career in human relations and industrial relations, as well as conflict management, to bear on today's workshop. I also happen to know he's been a Silver Knight recipient, and probably as important to me as anything, Gordon was extremely instrumental for many years in the very generous contributions from the Floor Corporation to the NMA Educational Foundation and our speech contest. Gordon holds a BS in Personnel Management and Industrial Relations from Bowling Green University, and Gordon will have to chat offline. I'm actually going to be participating in a leadership conference up there in July, and he has an MA in Industrial Relations from St. Francis College. His career has involved senior management positions in Westinghouse and Fluor for over 40 years. He has a long list of professional organizations. I won't share all those, but what I did learn that he's been a member of the Hanford Joint Council for Resolving Employee Concerns, and he's also a trained mediator with Dispute Resolution Council of the Tri-Cities. So I looked at that and I thought, well, that ought to come in handy today. So what I want to do is thank both of you for agreeing to conduct our session. And one note to all of our attendees, we will keep everybody muted, and Don can address this if he wants. And then there'll be spots in the program where we'll unmute if you have questions or want to chime in. But one other important note, this session on conflict management is being recorded. We have some chapters that couldn't join us today, and they've asked us to record it. So I want to be transparent and fully disclose that. So at this point, it's time for me to turn the microphone over to Don and Gordon.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate the wonderful introduction. And thank heavens there wasn't any conflict between us and how you were going to do it. The loud voice is Don. The reasonable voice is Gordon. And as you can see on the screen, I've characterized Gordon as the answer guy because today's organizational process that we're going to use is that it's really an introduction to the concept of conflict resolution, because in an hour it's kind of like just barely scratching the surface. But we are looking forward to doing it, and Gordon is the one who's got many stories, and I find that that's the way people really learn what it means to use a particular kind of approach on conflict resolution. I think all of us have at one time or another dealt with it in our own way, and sometimes more successful than not, which would probably include me. So with that, we will get moving on. This is going to be interesting. There we go. As you might guess, conflict, much like stress, is found anywhere, at work or home, and it's really is kind of a matter of perception how you deal with it. And I mean, you got to recognize that you can't always eliminate it. And in fact, many organizational approaches, like those of you who are familiar with project management, know that it is designed to create conflict, both in resource application and in design, and the amount of kind of resources you have, and those kinds of issues, so that you can recognize that there's an opportunity to do business differently, to make a number of decisions differently, and in essence, try and use it to keep costs down. If you're new to project management approaches, that always gets you kind of going, because it seems like you're fighting all the time. Gordon and I were sharing some war stories before we got going about our careers and where all the people we've crossed with and all that sort of thing. And you know, one of my favorite stories about conflict management was when I worked at Bettis, he who shouted the loudest won. And people think I'm being facetious about that, but there were many, many meetings that we dealt with things that way. But did we really get to the heart of the matter as quick as we could? That probably wasn't the best approach. Also, unaddressed conflict, and I think any of us who are leaders, not just managers, but leaders, have found ourselves in the position of seeing conflict go on between people, between groups of people, and find it very difficult to deal with. And I don't care what kind of conflict you're dealing with, it is always difficult to deal with unless you have identified the approach you're going to use and can identify quickly, is that approach working or not in terms of resolving it. But if you leave it sit there and fester, it is one of the worst organizational things in the world to have happen. And I would bet, of all the people out there on the line, that many of us would look at this and say, I can remember when I was in a situation like that, and it was uncomfortable every day to go to work. So, you know, oftentimes just that it's an opportunity is, in fact, the best way to deal with it and to be positive about it and not necessarily negative. So how do you recognize conflict and what do you do about it? And of course, that will determine much of your continuing success in leadership roles. Any of you who've read many leadership things find that the way you deal with it oftentimes will steer your career and people recognizing how well you lead. So they kind of go together. And our approach today is to take a little bit look at conflict itself, and then to also talk about the very specifics of ways that you can address it as our beginning introduction into this. Gordon, do you have anything you'd like to add? Or
just 2 points that make this so much more important even now than it was historically is this very litigious society we have. And sometimes people skip the steps in your protocols in your organization to resolve conflict and drag the old attorneys in. And now you've got third party in and you lose control. And the other area is, of course, in which I'm very familiar with, having done a lot, been through a couple strikes and stuff like that, is labor. If you don't take an interest-based approach with your labor unions and establish good relationships, it can be very, very, conflict-oriented.
Okay, so let's talk about what conflict is and why it kind of gets generated. I mean, as you can see, the classic definition up there, it's simply a situation when interests, needs, and goals or values of involved parties interfere with one another. And you can imagine how that happens all over the place, because You have different stakeholders and they have different priorities. You have team members who might have different ways of looking at things. Various departments, like a classic example is engineering and marketing, and how they like to have different opinions about things. As I mentioned earlier, project management is replete with it, because you're always trying to maximize the use of all your resources and find the very best that you can find for your project, and the heck with the other guy's project. And those kinds of things generate an awful lot of that. Organization and the client or stakeholders involved oftentimes in conflict, and we forget about that sometimes in terms of our client, and they look at you like, how are you meeting my objectives here if you're all the time involved in that sort of thing. Classic one is the boss and subordinate, and communications between the two, and depending on the amount of strategy you prove, sometimes that results in shouting matches, which are not good. I mean, I've never seen a good thing come out of a shouting match yet. On the other hand, there are times when being very direct about things is the way to do it, so nobody misunderstands. And then, sometimes organization needs and personal needs are sources that will result in some kind of conflict. So the key to all this is to manage it well. There are several management strategies which have been employed. We're going to talk about 5 of those today, and I will ask Gordon as we jump in and out of them to share some of his experience with you. And I'm going to try to open it up for any questions that you might have as we go through each of the types. And if it starts to lengthen this out, I'll probably have a conflict I got to deal with. But it really is choosing and executing the strategy that best fits the situation. And as you'll see in all 5 of these mechanisms, what we're going to talk, the strategies, what we're going to talk about is what the strategy is, when you can use that strategy, what it can be successful at, and then what are some of the caveats around that, because you're always making a trade-off in terms of when that strategy ought to be applied. And that's kind of why it's pretty important. And as we finish up, we'll give you a couple of hints and tools that will allow you to kind of focus in on what they are. So that's kind of where we're headed.
Just a comment that, when I helped work with our management teams, whether it was at Westinghouse, Florida, my last assignment at the City of Richmond, it's a matter of helping that manager to be the coach. And those of you who've been involved in whether it's Little League or coaching in high schools or amateur teams or whatever, coaching is very situational. You use that concept we all learned in situational leadership. You can scream and yell at one player and you have to put your arm around another player. And when you see conflict between two, that's where that situational approach really can come into play. What fits that situation? There's no one answer. There's no panacea for conflict, at least in my experience. And I've always coached whether it was an executive or a first line supervisor, said, all right, who are you dealing with here? Tell me about them. What do you know about them? And then try to make the situation work.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon.
Sure.
Maybe you can explain to me why coaches are so rational talking to officials.
Yeah.
Okay, several causes of conflicts. And this once again is just to kind of get you thinking about how to recognize what's going on, because depending on what the conflict is, sometimes it can make a big difference in how you go about solving it. Conflicting resources. I don't have enough of this, you got too much of that, those kinds of things. Conflicting styles. You have some people who are very straightforward, kind of let's get it done sort of people, and others who have a much different style, perhaps more laid back, and you kind of wonder if they're schedule oriented or not. Those kind of things. Sometimes those styles just kind of cause a clash. Conflicting perceptions. This is a big topic within any kind of conflict, because it's how each individual group sees it, and what their perceptions of where the other person are coming from. So perception is key. conflicting goals. That's kind of, but sometimes, you know, the one person wants to minimize a particular kind of result, and at the same time there's risk involved in meeting some other goal, and that of course leads into conflicting pressures. You know, at least in the times in which I was managing a number of our production operations, you always got this issue of you know, are you going to put safety over production? You know, those sorts of things, because the results aren't good when you do that, or when you put production over safety. So managing the two together is really an integrated process, but they do cause conflicting pressures, and you have to deal with both, because you're expected to have a safe workplace. You're expected when you're coaching kids on the field that they'll come back without injuries, and so the heck is this? So sorry about that. I had a conflict with a computer. You know, so you get those trade-offs you have to make, and the truth of the matter is keeping them in balance and well integrated is really what maximizes the results for both in the end. Conflicting roles. I spent 9 years as a safety manager because somehow people thought I could work real well with my operational background with the operating guys and also with the safety guys. But conflicting roles between those two can lead to conflicts. Different personal values, and what you find to be most important can arise conflicts in all kinds of group settings and situations. And of course, none of us have had unpredictable policies come to play, things that we didn't expect or didn't know, which all of a sudden really create a very difficult work environment. So those are kind of a whole listing of kind of potential causes of conflict, and you know, use those as you look at and evaluate things. What we're going to talk about are 4 or 5 ways of handling conflict, and these things, this little chart literally represents, as you can see, on one side a concern for others and a concern for self, and so this is kind of a conceptual sort of thing, but we're going to talk about accommodating, which is as you see, the friendly helper, but we're also going to talk about in the other corner competitive, which is a tough battler. And as you'll see, there are times when either one of those ought to be used, but you put certain other things at risk if you don't use some skill in how they're applied. Avoiding the problem, essentially, there are times you may want to do that. Well, not only want to do it, but need to do it. But there are other times when it's important to not choose this one. And then there is compromising, which in our world today of politics we hear an awful lot of. Gee, can't you two guys compromise on this and get something on so we have a federal budget going? But it's not quite that simple, and kind of finding the middle ground on many things is what compromising is all about. Collaborating is as most people like to think is really a good process to use because it builds teams, and so we'll talk about that at some length, because there are times when it doesn't apply as well and times when it's really strong. What you'll see is exactly what Gordon said. There's a different situation every time, and you need to figure out which of these will work the best for you. So with that, we're going to head into our first one, which is the competitive one, oftentimes called forcing. And as you can see, there's a list of things when it may be appropriate. You know, this kind of is oftentimes looked at as as a situation where there's a lot of battling and battering going on because one person is just literally trying to push their solution onto the other one. And so, as you can see, when it may be appropriate, basically when you need to stand up for your rights, what I reflect on is when a quick resolution is required, and it says using force is justified. Now, force is not physical force in this case. It is the imposition probably of your personality more than anything else to get it done. And there are times, and I can remember situations where I found myself in the emergency response mode, and the collective you, if you will, who was in charge of this particular thing, needed to make a decision and make it quick. And you could not argue about who was right and who was wrong. You simply had to talk about what was your criteria for the decision, and this is what it was, and let's get on with it. When fire is laughing at the walls, literally, you don't want to be arguing about who's going to go in and put it out. I'd like to talk a little bit about what the caveats are here that are described, because oftentimes this approach, particularly when it's not in one of those kind of situations I just described, and it's kind of your mode of operation all the time, it takes an awful lot away from trust and the ability for people to want to work with you over the long term, and that's not a good collective thing. Same thing is true with causing an opponent to react in the same way. How many times do you hear about action gets a reaction? And that's exactly what this is talking about. The person will respond in the same manner. I used to work for a boss who I called the pugilist, because I felt like we were getting ready for a boxing match, and he was a former boxer, and so it made life kind of interesting. But it caused me to get my back up just as tough, and none of that's really good, and you don't get good decisions. The other caveat is it doesn't give you the opportunity to learn what the other guys, what the advantage of the other guy's approach is, and therefore be able to resolve it. And all of this takes a lot more energy with a result that you generally don't like very often, unless it's one of those quick things that's got to be made and get on with it. So, how have you been successful with this one, Gordon?
Well, in a couple of arenas that are very different arenas, but they can both take the same place. In my family mediations I do now as a retiree, which I've just been doing now for a year, we're facilitators, the mediators, trying to get the couple, generally their parenting issues, trying to get the couple together. It had a lot to do with parenting plans and custody issues and stuff like that. It's heart-rending. But the one thing we can hold over their head, and we need it sometimes, is when they're planting their feet, is that we say, okay, what's the alternative? We can stop the meet now. It's a voluntary mediation, and you're going to go back to court. And you get in court, and you've got a guardian ad litem there. You've got the judge, and the judge is going to make a ruling. And probably neither one of you are going to like it. The second example I would use is in labor relations, where you can go with the formal process if you need to, and sometimes you need to maintain precedent or your company position or whatever, and the union will do the same thing. And so you go to arbitration, or you use a federal mediation and conciliation mediator, but they're just trying to keep peace. They very rarely, I hope there's none on the line, but they very rarely can bring a real positive resolution. You have to come up with it yourself. But if you go to arbitration, in most cases, the arbitrator will split the pie, we call it, and neither one of you are going to be happy again. So there's some real dangers, and especially, like Don said, when you get into a relationship situation, especially when we use it for the labor relations piece, if you want to have an ongoing relationship with that union, arbitration is not going to enhance that. But sometimes you have to, and that's when you get into this forcing, competing, this part of the business.
Okay. Thanks, Gordon. If I can figure out how, Sue, if you're out there, would you kind of unmute things, or folks, if you're muted up and you have a question, let me know if you have any questions this far. Okay, do we have somebody with a question? Okay, hearing none, I'm gonna move on unless there is.
Just a second, we're
I have
gonna
a
go.
question.
Okay, hang on, we got a couple people. For me, tell me your name and kind of where you're from, and then give me your question.
Well, this is Glenn. I'm from Fort Worth, and my question is, using this forcing competitive technique, would that be advisable whenever you're taking over another company and you have a conflict of senior managers or leadership?
I've been through a lot of Gordon. I've been through a lot of transitions at these Department of Energy sites where new contractors come in, et cetera. And we had a very complex one here a number of years ago. We had 7 subcontractors and the prime contractor. And I tried to use an interest-based approach, and I didn't get anywhere. I had to use that forced competing style initially to set the ground rule, because by the contract we were under, the personnel policy we were trying to put in, or 42 of them put in place, had to be those of the prime contractor. So I couldn't have what I used to call the UN debate with all the other, this is Lockheed Martin, a lot of big companies that were just major corporations. But we had to use this more forceful competing type of style to set the basic parameters. And then we had to go about, so there can be a place for it. And that might be a good example that you cited, where you're coming in, you're taking over, or it's new and you've got to, by edict or by contract, you've got to establish that program under your guidance.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
And this is Glenn Button with the Boeing Leadership Association of Southern California.
Hi, Glenn. What you got?
And I just wanted to remark that it seems like this would be especially appropriate in a battlefield situation, and that's why you've got the strong chain of command in the military, or even in an emergency room kind of situation where you've got a patient on the table.
Well, this is Gordon again. I was in Vietnam, and I was an air traffic controller officer. And that's exactly what had to happen sometimes. I wasn't going to have a debate with my technician about what happened with those 10 airplanes that were under my control. And sometimes you have to be very directive, and there's not a lot of debate, and that's the way it had to work sometimes. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, there are times when this really, and it's when you need a very time-sensitive response that is what people understand they need to do now. So, okay,
Good example.
all right, those are both good questions. Unless somebody's got a burning one, I would like to move on to the next area.
Hey, Don, this is Steve Bailey. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do I got a conflict with you?
Yeah, not at all. Not yet. I've had a couple people chat and even someone call in. They were wondering if you could maybe turn on your camera. They'd like to see you and Gordon. And I didn't know if you were absent by design or by accident. So I thought, oh, well, no guts, no glory. I just asked.
Well, it's because Sue trained me, and I have very little understanding sometimes of what to do. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, and somebody needs to holler at me if this creates a problem. I think maybe when I get to the question areas, I will turn the sharing off. Now, I don't know if we're anywhere. Can you see me?
No.
Where's my trainer?
Man, he knows he's at home.
And we can't see your presentation. Your presentation's off too. You need to share your screen again.
Oh, you got to go through that again?
Yes. There should be a little camera in the lower corner, and you could turn that on. Just click on it, and it should turn your video on.
Meanwhile, I'm going to take my ugly face off.
Yeah, please do that.
There.
Anything?
You have
Just a minute. Let me look.
Yes, you need to lower your
To the top of
camera.
your head.
Yeah, move your camera down some.
Your
Because all we
hairline.
can see is the pictures in back of your head.
Ah, well, those are from France, so you know.
We're
There
getting
you go. There. Down again. A little bit more. There. That's good.
Okay. So you can see our ugly faces.
I'm going to mute everybody now.
Yeah, that's good. Now that they're through heckling me. Okay. Maneuvering and navigating on this thing, so sorry about that. The next, oops. How do I do this? Oh, okay. I'm doing what I know how to do, so who knows how this is going to work. I think I probably lost you.
It's back. You're good.
Oh, you got, okay. See, I can't tell, and that's fine. In the next area we wanted to talk about is really in dark, what I would call big contrast to the one we just talked about. And that is where both sides want to have some kind of win-win solution, and it's not a I won, you won, or I know you lost, or whatever. And where this might be appropriate is where you have a number of parties that are involved, and you kind of got to get agreement from everybody, so you're all working towards the same objective. Addressing the interests of multiple stakeholders. There are not too many of us that don't get involved in situations where both either internally or externally to our companies, that we don't have a list of people who all have some interest in what's going on, and that may in fact have generated the conflict which we're dealing with. And this is a good way to try and settle some of those things, particularly when they're very complex. It's a good one to use when everybody has a fairly high level of trust with each other, because the team then comes together a lot quicker than having to go through that trust building cycle that we use. And of course, this is a good one when you've created some hard feelings, which I have done a number of times, not realizing it, just because I'm kind of a straightforward sort of person and people think I'm putting them down. But then to have to go back and build up a group of people and help them come up with a solution. This is a good approach to use it, because you're dealing with complex problems. The advantage, of course, is you get pretty good solutions. You're actually working on the problem. Oftentimes I've used the phrase with the folks that I've been working with, hey, it's not the person you're dealing with, it's the problem, and let's focus on what the problem is, not the person. And it really does reinforce mutual trust and long-term kinds of outcomes. And when you move forward with a solution to a problem, the place you don't want to be is a situation where you're the one in charge and it's your solution and nobody else is pitching in. You really want a shared responsibility for the outcome, because it keeps the team working together. And of course, for whoever's done this, they earn the reputation of a good negotiator. I personally, and you can tell this if you work with me very long, I don't care about negotiation. I try and sort out what's the thing that needs to be accomplished and what's the best way to do it. At least I like to think I do that. Now the caveats to this are, it really does require commitment from all the parties, and it requires a lot more effort and time. If you've ever done this, it's hard work. Sometimes you have to set your own agendas aside to consider what's best for the team. And so that the need for that is, if you only have really only have a short period of time to do it. And sometimes we make mistakes in judging how that is. Why? I don't know how I did that. I touched someone. Here we are. You can in fact turn yourself going the wrong direction. But if it's a short-term thing, this approach, unless you can zero in really quickly on what the problem is and what the potential solutions are, is really tough to do in a quick mode. And so, Gordon, you want to?
Yeah, I think this is a great way to deal for a long-term relationship with a union, for example, or an employer-employee situation where they're going to have to work together for a long time. Yeah, it does take more time, and Don's exactly right. But if you really want to maintain a relationship to avoid future conflict, it's worth the time and effort. We used it in my last couple of negotiations with our unions at the city. We had 6 unions, police, fire, streets, etc. And it worked, but we didn't wait to do that when negotiations started. That was a relationship situation, but the idea was, next year we got bargaining, the contract's up, the triennial contract, and let's figure out what you really need out of this, and I'm going to let you know what the city needs or whatever. And it was a lot better way to do it because we knew we didn't want to go to arbitration. It's expensive, and again, you split the pie. So again, if you've got that situation where you want a longer-term relationship, it is, my opinion, worth the time and money and effort to do it. But both parties have to be willing to expend that. And then I think it works very, very well.
Okay. If you would like to unmute and ask a few questions, go ahead. Okay, somebody unmuted. Question?
All things being equal, is this the approach you would use as your first go-to?
This Gordon, I would. If the manager or HR, whoever's getting involved with it, assesses that there's a long-term relationship needed here, yes, I definitely would spend the time and the money. You might have to do a temporary fix to abate a problem. But by the way, when we do this for our parenting situations, our mediations, they sometimes want to think these are generally young couples. I always say they're kids raising kids, but anyway, they don't want to think long-term, and you want them to think about that, even though they may be divorcing, and again, that's what happens in most cases. You still want them to think about, because in the state of Washington, like other states, you may be divorced, but you're still a parent, and that child is what we're concerned about, okay? And so that's where we have to keep them focused on a longer-term relationship. But I found it to be especially effective in union relations. I really do. I think it's and a lot of unions are using it and embracing it, and sometimes it's hard to get the management to embrace it. But if you really want to work together day to day, as well as we wound up not having, we had very few grievances at my last organization. Now, I'm not taking credit for it. It was a culture that we'd established of working together. And I think that can really reap a lot of benefits in the long run, in addition to the instant issue.
At the risk of that some of my friends out there are listening, the last job I had was director of our chemistry labs at the Hanford site, and in particular, for 6 to 8 years, I was assigned to those labs as the director or immediate manager. And in that period of time, I tried to do this as much as I could by getting the right people around the table and finding the right person to be in charge. And sometimes that was a union person. But I got to tell you, when we finally, because these problems were never simple. I mean, you'd think they were, but they were never simple. And so we, in that 9-year period, was 6, 7, 8, 9 years, I didn't have one grievance. not one. And we wound up discharging people, it's almost always has, because it's part of the role, if you will, to always fight discharges. But it was so plain and clear that that was what needed to happen, that you didn't get into a lot of the usual things. And a lot of it was because using processes which involve involvement like this does, gives you a lot of trust in where people are coming from, and that they're not playing games with you and that sort of thing. So I had some good results with this. I will tell you there were other times when it was, hey, no, this is what we got to do. We got to get it done now. You had some time to share what you saw as the problem, get on with it. But this was kind of the base way of trying to operate. And if you're in an organization that has tough schedules to meet and all that sort of thing, it takes a little bit of what my friends used to call chutzpah to stand up and just say, no, this is what we got to do. And yet when people see good results, they too will trust you with that. Anything else? Another question? Okay, we're going to move on if that's okay with folks. This came up inadvertently. One of the steps which you can use is compromising. And you can see, good times to use that are when the goals are moderately important. Maybe you don't need to get all the way to the end where you're going, and you can make some trade-offs. Sometimes it is one of those situations that allows you to buy time. And so in a particularly complex issue, if you can identify, well, we have this near-term solution and we're going to be working this longer-term solution, sometimes that will lead to an effective compromising situation. If you do take that approach, you can't do the short-term solution and then throw the long-term one out, because it messes your credibility all up. So you have to follow up on and be disciplined in what you're doing. It also helps you get to expedient solutions on important issues. And there is that class that it's highly urgent and highly important. And so it lets you get there in a way that is not going to lead to bad feelings and that sort of thing. At least that's what the task is. And frankly, the advantages are it's faster. It can provide that temporary solution. And sometimes that's enough to lower the tension levels and let you work on the longer term solution. The caveats are, and this is a little bit like what Gordon was describing before, you can wind up resulting in a situation which nobody's happy with, in that they wound up in a position where they only got part way where they needed to get to, and both parties got that way, and now they're mixed up on where they're at with their goals, and it can foment some things in the organization that are not healthy, unless you're very straightforward and very transparent about what you're doing. In the long run, it does not necessarily contribute towards building trust, and of course it requires some close monitoring and control, that when you compromise to certain things, that you do in fact follow through on the agreements which are met. And sometimes these things can be resource commitments, they can be the dollars, any way you want to look at it. But compromising is one of those ones that can get you to a fairly effective solution that's moderately complex. Gordon?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because there's a natural affinity for people to want to mitigate the situation as quick as they can and move on. Again, the long-term result there, this may not be the best way to go. And by the way, the other almost alter ego to this is you go back down into that competitive, if you got to take a tough situation, or you're willing to go to arbitration, or you're willing to, there are times when I have advised management, let them sue us. It's a pain, it's expensive, but there's just times when you say, we're not going to compromise on that either ethical principle or whatever, and let's go, let a third party adjudicate it. but occasionally you have to do that. So compromising, you got to be really careful with that, because you can have a very good short-term gain, and long-term you gave away the store or you hurt something. So it's one of the trickiest ones to use, believe it or not. My opinion.
And it takes a lot of skill.
It does take a lot of skill, a lot of energy.
Okay, bear with me. I'm going to try and cover the next area as well, and then we'll open it for questions. This one is called avoidance, and in people relationships, it's got lots of other different terms associated with it. But basically, if you believe the issue is one which is trivial and not important, why waste the time fussing with it? Just kind of say, okay, make the decision and let's go, and we're okay. But you got to decide that that's a trivial issue, and have thought at least that much of it through. Sometimes, if there are those important issues are pressing, this may be the thing to do. If it's one where you're going to buy time and just kind of withdraw and want to go think about it, my take is don't just withdraw, just say, we need to work on this a little more, and I need to think about it some more. And people, so they don't get the idea that you're just walking away from trying to deal with the problem. I guess it's appropriate if you see no chance of getting your concerns met. I would hope as leaders that we're more optimistic about where we are than that. But I think sometimes you may find yourself in there. Sometimes it's better to withdraw when you're having to deal with hostility. And I would tell you, to me, that I think that is a situation where it's got to be a temporary thing and not continued. Not a continuing thing in terms of withdrawing from the conflict because of the hostility. I know people do that in many different ways. The only time I can think of it when it's appropriate is when in a work situation where you say, hey, let's take a 10-minute break or something, and then come back and try and address it a little differently. Maybe when you're unable to handle the conflict and you say, hey, I can't deal with this, let's get somebody else involved. Now, the advantages of doing this are if somebody is using some type of an aggression, that sort of thing. Withdrawing is a low stress approach for the individual who's withdrawing. Can give you time and ability to focus, and as you see, it can give you better time. But if you want to do that, I think you talk about it. I don't think you just walk away, because that leads to some real misunderstandings on the part of the other individual or group who's involved in the conflict, and so they may take that in many different ways, and you wind up with something that just goes the wrong way. And oftentimes you look at, why did it go the wrong way? It's, well, I didn't think anybody was going to listen to me. I thought there wasn't a chance, nothing was going to happen. And so I just said the heck with it and left. And then you got something that wasn't very worthwhile at all. Some of the caveats, of course, are it may lead to weakening your position. Not acting may be interpreted as agreeing. How many times have you heard, silence is agreement? And sometimes dealing with a person's personality, it may just be that they're not agreeing, but they aren't telling you what's going on either, because they've got some. If you're going to use this particular one and not have it negatively impact you, it takes just some very special skills to do that. And I think a lot of those are involved in terms of saying, this is what's bothering me. We need to take a break. Let's then come back and attack the problem. But you see this a lot in marriage relationships and stuff where the relationship just goes down the tube. So this one makes me the most uncomfortable to talk about, because I just don't think it's the way to deal with problems.
A couple things on this one. One thing I learned in those kind of situations is where you're trying to calm the situation down and just, put a damper on it temporarily. And the person says, okay, fine. And that's what we used to call malicious compliance. And they say, fine, that's okay. Yeah, okay, we'll do it your way. As soon as they leave the room, though, they're just saying, that's BS. It's not what I wanted to do, but I did that so that they would, wouldn't be yelling at me or we wouldn't continue the problem, when in fact you didn't gain anything. So you have to be very careful that when the person agrees, even for a temporary respite there, that they're really not going to go behind your scenes. The other thing is the use of, and I've had to do this a lot, in special when we have potential violence in the workplace situations, which takes the top priority if you've got conflict. And I just had one before I left the city. And we had to put people on paid leave and just let it calm down. I mean, this was weeks of paid leave and then to get more information and to be ready to deal with it. So there are times when you need to take that time out that Don referred to. It could be an hour. It could be a long time. Weeks. When you just say, we do this a lot in the police and fire area where we have accidents. We have a officer involved shooting, as you know, that's a big deal right now. And you got to collect yourself. You got to get the person out of the situation and out of harm's way, etc. So I agree with Don. It's not something I would use as a long-term solution, but it can keep things from maybe escalating where you don't want them to be.
Yeah, but it's a situation where it's a controlled withdrawal as opposed to.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. If you'd like to ask some questions about either of the last, because they are different. One was compromised and the other one was withdrawing. Open up your line and ask away. Once again, please let me know who it is. It's not all that big a deal. It's just my thing with wanting to know who I'm talking to.
Don, this is Steve Bailey. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We got one in on the chat line where somebody wants to know, and this will be fun. What would you suggest Congress use as their conflict resolution option? And then there was a follow-up, and why are they having so much trouble right now in resolving conflict? This ought to be good.
If this is Gordon, if I could comment on that a little bit. I just attended 3 nights ago, a presentation through our mediation. It was an in-service deal. And we had 2 people that were formerly on the UN peacekeeping program for conflict resolution. And they were talking about their work down in Central America, in Guatemala, etc. And they identified what they call the main cause for conflict. It was a need that someone had that created a problem that resulted in a conflict, and they were trying to avoid a crisis. And when I look at Congress or the Senate, there seems to be a need that they have that's different sometimes than the expectation that we citizens had when we elected those people. And we expected, there's different expectations, but they go in with a preconceived, agenda, so to speak. It's just like 2 employees coming together, or an employee and supervisor that each have an agenda. Until that agenda is dealt with, and there's a common ground for what's really needed for the best of the organization, in this case with your question for the country, or the program that you're looking at, as long as they're postured and you get into your partisan politics, etc., I don't know how you get too far, because it's basic conflict management. But if they come in with an open mind, say, we really need to get this done. And I would use the example of what happened immediately after 9/11. All of a sudden, there wasn't partisan politics initially. 12, 13 years later, it comes out again that there was. But there wasn't at the time because they had an urgent need to resolve something and everybody came together. So I think there's a matter of motivation there and interests. That's when you get interest-based bargaining. You've got to find that common ground of interests. And I think that's a real problem with our government right now.
All right. Thank you, Gordon. I know we're running short on time. We got one more question that came in. So let me throw this at you guys. It says, how does compromise work if one party is blatantly wrong? For example, Group 1's that do not shoot the messenger. Group 1 says 1 + 1 = 3, but Group 2 says 1 + 1 = 2. then on scientific issues, it doesn't always seem possible to compromise. So can you answer that in 2 minutes?
I'll let our scientists answer that.
Yeah, right. Interestingly enough, we actually in the workplace, highly technical workplace, lots of scientific staff have had to put in place a procedure and policy on how you go about resolving technical differences. And sometimes that does involve bringing in other folks to take a look with you who might have different ideas. And of course that costs more money and time, but that's what you got to do. Sometimes it was as simple as, in organizations I've worked in, we've had people who were called fellow engineers or scientists who were extremely experienced and broad, and had different ways of looking at it, and so you could go off and get them involved on a professional level as opposed to any kind of managerial kind of level, and get the issue solved. I had some interesting things going on one time with radiation counts and where were they coming from, and gee, were we having a spread of contamination? And you can do some interesting things with this in the technical environment. And one of the things we concluded was, after a very similar review to what I just talked about, was that much of what was going on was actually fallout from weapons testing and that sort of stuff. And you'd say, "Oh no, that can't be." Well, you get to the source of the particular material. I didn't do that, believe me. That took some really high level talented working with the people who had the issues and thought there were messed up numbers on the counts and what you were doing. But that was one way, was to involve some of our recognizable people who had earned the title of fellow.
Ms. Gordon, and we get this a lot in the parenting mediations where they've just, because there's children involved, and they just absolutely plant their feet, and you can tell. And this is when we call a caucus, because we use 2 mediators, and these are face-to-face mediations. Once in a while, we get a shuttle mediation with a couple. I had one last week with a couple, just they couldn't be in the same room. But what we try to, we'll call a caucus, we'll split out with them, and we kind of say, look, you planted your feet here. Now, if you're going to tell us, and it's up to you because we don't tell them what to do, if you're going to take that position, then you know what? This mediation's over. Because there has to be a certain amount of compromise. Or if you're not going to compromise on this issue, there's a quid pro quo here. What are you going to compromise on? Because no matter what anybody says, it's a negotiation. So if you find, my experience is if someone is, and it could be a management point, it can be an employee, just planted their feet, I say, okay, my role here is going to end, and we're either going to have a grievance on it if it's a union employee, and we're going to go get that, maybe arbitrated, or we're going to go to court, or whatever you want to do. Do you really want to do that and get involved with a third party? Sometimes it brings them back down to earth. It's tough with technical people because, like Don said, some of these people have such technical expertise. That's why some of the companies like GE used to use a dual path, a parallel path. They used to call it. My wife worked for GE, where you got a person who's not going to be in a management, career path. They're going to be up in the professional one because they are the expert. And the way GE did it, jet engines anyway, was that they had authority. Those subject matter experts, those individuals, they had authority over sometimes general management in the technical arena. So it wasn't something you could compromise on, and you got to assess that.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on here. We can get done as close to when we were supposed to. So, the last area is accommodating or smoothing. Essentially, this is something to get something else. It's not quite a compromise, but it's okay. I'll give up on that item, and you're willing to sacrifice something that you don't think is all that important. Once again, I think this one is personally a placating thing, but it turns out, you know, if you think about that first box up there that we're looking at, it says when it's important to provide temporary relief, and sometimes that's what you got to do. Is you got to find a way to buy some time, and basically, if the issue really isn't as important to you as it is to the other party, maintain the relationship, put it down as a future thing to, you know, build yourself some credit with them and move on and go back to work. Interestingly enough, if you've been in this conflict and you kind of conclude, I think I am wrong, in which case, then you know, that can be a good way to handle getting out of the conflict. And then, you know, basically when you evaluated the situation, said there's not a lot of choice here, or you know, if we continue this, it's just going to be really detrimental. So I can give up on this point and let's move on. You know, you can see what the advantages are: protecting more important interests, an opportunity to reassess, and sometimes that's probably the most important thing you get out of it. And of course, what you deal with here is the risk that and I hate the word opponent in these things, but that your opponent may try to take advantage of you. May think that's, you know, if I can get it this way, that's the kind of gamesmanship I'm going to go through. And that it, you know, it may work on your confidence level, particularly if the other guy's aggressive.
Yeah, I think where this is helpful, in my experience, has been when I've seen a conflict, whether it's employee-employer, employee-supervisor, where it wasn't about major issues, it was about feelings. Somebody had hurt feelings, or someone got aggressive, or someone, and so then you can use that smoothing approach. Can work where you get them together, maybe you talk a little bit, maybe you do it in, you know, shuttle type mediation where they're not in the same room, but you give them a chance to cool down. And the more you find out about that it was really a hurt feeling, or someone, you know, just took something real personal, and you get that out in the open, the facade of the interest that they had really goes away. So there's a place for it, but if there's somebody with a firm position that needs to, you know, you really have to resolve something, this isn't the way to do it, in my opinion.
Right. Okay. So, does somebody have a burning desire on this one, other than Bailey asking us these high political questions? Okay, just a couple more items to cover with you. This, once again, is a little different look-see at the model as to where we started. You know, competition's important. You know, you can use it when the relationship isn't all that important. It's a big-time issue, and the goal is to win. I mean, that's kind of what's there because of the kind of characteristics of that particular quadrant. Collaboration, on the other hand, puts an emphasis on high relationships, high issues, win-win. And as we talked about before, it does require some time. The goal is to find the middle ground in compromising, and sometimes that's a ground that nobody likes. And then avoidance is literally the goal being one to delay if it's not a very important issue or you don't care much about the relationship. As Gordon said, sometimes if you care about the relationship, you know, but your goal is to yield, then that may be important. But if you've roughed somebody up, I was thinking about what he said. If you've roughed somebody up and you realize, oh my, I really was wrong, at that point, you're really better off to move into an area of accommodation. So just in kind of a look-see at the model, that's some of the stuff to think about and to use. Approach factors. These are just questions I like to ask myself. Is it really important? And sometimes we think things are important, they're not. And I think this is a soul-searching question. Is it crunch time? You know, is it something that's got to be done now, or is it not really? Is it just somebody's idea of when a schedule was and why? And to answer the why question, is there an imminent danger? Because that'll lead you to do certain things quickly right now, at least to take some mitigating action and then perhaps figure out how to deal with this situation permanently. How complex is it? The more complex it is, the more people and parties who are going to be involved, and the approach that you're going to have to take is one which lets everybody get their part of the issue out in the open. Is there a level of risk for the organization or one of the parties that's not acceptable? And if there is, then how do you deal with that, and how do you work your way through it? Leads you to pick what I would call is normally, unless it's a really, really acceptable risk right now, that imminent danger part, the level of risk is one which really takes a group to manage its way through, because you're talking long-term solutions here, long-term interactions. What happens if it's the wrong choice? I mean, ask yourself that. Hey, I'm just going to walk away from this. Ask yourself, is that the wrong thing to be doing just because it's easier? Who are your stakeholders? And really think about that, because there are people we don't think about sometimes as being stakeholders in things that are really the people who, in the end, are the ones who have to deal with what the result is. Do we need help in resolving it? Technical parties, regulatory people. It's hard to believe that you want to involve them, but sometimes that's the best way to do it. Mediators. On the regulatory party thing, I've worked through some very, very difficult situations where the company was going to be very heavily fined, and by the way you could do it, you could come to a result where it wasn't so extreme, and in fact it allowed you to go do another piece of work that previously you hadn't been prepared to do or been approved to do, that needed to get done. I mean, you're not manipulating here. It's one of the things that grew out of the regulatory process. And always ask yourself, how's the customer impacted? Who that customer is, internal and external, and all those things. When you answer those questions, you're probably going to be able to pick a method that will allow you to hack what's going on. The next chart's a summary. Gordon, you have any final comments before we get to?
No, it's other than bless you. I'm glad I'm retired, because being a supervisor or manager in this day and age is very difficult. Like I said earlier, with such a litigious society right now, and unfortunately, and many of you face this, I know you have, that you wind up having to settle a case when in fact you knew you were right in principle, or you knew who was right, and but yet on a purely business standpoint, it was cheaper to settle. And I've had to do those settlements, and they're painful. And I was a lot more ideological or idealistic when I was 35 than when I was 55. But these approach factors that Don outlined, that's worth the time to go through, or sit with the manager if you're helping the referee here, or even with the employee and say, okay, let's talk about what do you really want. In our mediation, it's what we call finding out what the interests are of the parties. Not they do an opening statement, they tell us what they think they want, but then we try to get at what are the true, quote, interests in. And if that you can help resolve, then a lot of the stuff will fall into place. What do they really want out of it?
Okay, so in summary, conflict is everywhere. We shouldn't be scared by that. We just ought to be able to face into it and take care of it, and sometimes that is difficult. There are several management strategies for conflict. In summary, forcing, compromise, collaborating, withdrawing, and smoothing. And where you can use collaboration, you usually wind up with a good solution. Depends on if you have the time or not. But once again, look at those questions. And the right one depends on the situation. This is that situational thing that Gordon talked about very, very early on. And take the time to evaluate it, because if you're just doing it to push your way through things, you're going to be back to that conflict again. And the deal here is to put it to bed and keep it there so you can get off and deal with other things. Otherwise, it keeps coming up in different forms. The last thing I would say is I recognize that a lot of what we've talked to you about today is, in fact, introductory kind of material. And so, don't hesitate to appeal to the folks in your workplace and in your company who are really good at doing this, whether they are, in one of the support staffs like HR or in the counsel's office. That's hard to picture, but sometimes the lawyers are good folks at this. But because it really is difficult and a little more intricate process sometimes. Recently, I read a book called Conflict Resolution, and it has 8 very specific steps in it. I'm not going to cover those with you, but I want to tell you this book is written by a Dudley Weeks, and I got it on Amazon for nothing, literally. And it takes the collaboration aspect more than anything else. It talks about building a partnership and how you do that and how do you get to what that person really needs. And so, if you want to go onto something else besides just pulling up whatever the internet happens to show you, there are lots of good books in this area. And I'll bet in most areas where you live, there will be something called the Dispute Resolution Council or something like that that can kind of get you pointed in the right direction if you too want to know more and know how to deal with these things or how to diffuse them. And of course, good leadership training like we offer through NMA, I got to give you the plug, will help you an awful lot with this particular topic. So that's the conclusion of our webinar today. If you have some comments, I'm quite willing to stay here and take them. I think Gordon's got to go, but we can discuss some more. But I know other people have workplace commitments to get back to. So thank you very much. This is my first webinar. If you couldn't tell by the way I fumbled around with some of the stuff, especially using Zoom. And it's an easier one of these things to use. So I hope you'll overlook those difficulties, but it's been a privilege for me, as I hope it has for Gordon, to talk, to spend an hour or so with you talking about a topic that in today's workplace is very important.
Well, Don and Gordon, this is Steve. Gordon, I'm going to ask you to lean in closer to Don. We've only seen about half your face the whole time.
You're lucky. Yeah.
I know. Now, there's what Gordon.
Not mine. Okay.
So that's what Gordon looks like. I wasn't sure how to make that happen, so I just figured they've got some glory. You should both know that I'm looking at the attendees/participants, and nearly everybody has stayed on. This has been a really great, almost 90 minutes here. It's gone extremely well. I have a feeling I'm going to get asked for you guys to do a follow-up, and if anybody wants to go that route, just let us know what you want Don and Gordon to talk about.
Well, the paid political advertisement, Steve, is that this is part of a presentation from our professional development committee, as a lot of these are these days. And this was an introduction, so let Steve know, particularly Steve, flood him with your emails. But we would be happy to go to the next step or two in this particular topic, because it does take a while, and even to get the basics. So if it was meaningful to you, we're there. That's what we're here for.
Well, I'm going to I don't know if Sue has everybody unmuted or not. I'll give her a second to do that. Some other people might want to chime in. So I'm going to close out by saying
goodbye, guys.
Bye. We got to go back to work. Sorry.
That's important.
Yes. You going to leave the meeting?
Yes.
Leave the meeting.
So this is Glenn Button. I had just one quick practical question. Do you find that there's quite a bit of overlap between these 5 areas? I don't see that there's a sharp line in between them. What is your experience?
This is Gordon. No, you're exactly right, Glenn. I think I've used all of them because I've had to, but I think it's like a toolbox. And, I look at the situation, do I use a wrench here or a screwdriver or a hammer? And they do. And by the way, in a mediation, we go through all these steps. To this point, you might back off. When you say, hey, that's where we're at, move on. You've already resolved that. Or, okay, how about a little compromise here? So, yeah, it's a toolbox. And I would go into, just like a general repairman, I would go in with that whole toolbox.
Yeah, I think you flow across the whole dynamic of this thing from one to another. And particularly if there is one of these things that's being used incorrectly, which is easy to do. But the situation has changed. Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, if we get a copy of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna do the PowerPoint. So I'm gonna send the PowerPoint back.
Okay, you got my, go to you, are you?
Yes, that's why I had the type of.
Yeah, but that was great.
Sounds like we're ready to close out.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Does indeed. Thanks, guys.